Thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate your testimony. Acting Administrator Elwell, although the investigations of both of these crashes are still ongoing, the investigators have gathered enough data to confirm similarities between the two crashes. The most prominent link seems to be a new software unique to the Boeing 737 MAX called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, more commonly known as MCAS. From the FAA's perspective, was there any information on this new MCAS system that was required to be included or was included in the, quote, short self-administered online course that pilots are required to go through before flying the MAX?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. The MCAS system is indeed, as I mentioned, of great attention in both of these tragic accidents. And the MCAS is actually a sub-device to a system called the speed trim system that is in the NG, in the prior 737. What the MCAS does is 737 MAX is a fly-by-wire aircraft. Fly-by-wire aircraft, the controls, the yoke, that controls the flight controls needs to feel right to a pilot. And so what the MCAS does is it gives inputs to the flight controls when necessary in a very thin envelope, thin piece of the flight envelope in certain regimes so that the pilots, the yoke feels exactly like it should. And in this case, the MCAS made the MAX feel exactly like the NG to fly. So for that reason, we gave it an amended type certificate because of its similarity to the NG, because of what the MCAS system aided the pilots in the feel and the fly of the airplane. And we have, for a certification of this type, a flight standardization board comprised of pilots from Europe, Canada, the United States, who come together and fly the aircraft that is being amended, in this case 737 NG, and the new aircraft. And they fly it and are monitored by engineers and experts specifically to see if they have or notice differences in the flight characteristics, the handling characteristics of the new airplane, because that would trigger us to need flight training for this new device.
Administrator Elwell, let me try to refocus you back on the specific question I asked, which is, was there any information on the MCAS that was included in the short self-administered online course that pilots were required to go through?
There was not specific instruction on the MCAS to my knowledge, specifically because it was not a system that went directly to what the pilots flew on the MAX, the difference between the MAX and the NG.
Well, that might be true in ordinary circumstances, but as I understand it, on previous versions of the 737, when the pilot pulled back on the yoke, it cut off the electronic control of the stabilizers. But with the MCAS, it did not. And presumably pilots would not know this if it was not included in their training and they were not made aware of that. Is that correct?
So, Senator, the MCAS gives input to the flight controls, as I said, in a very small flight envelope. In this case we're talking about here, errant information to that system would make it give input where it's not needed and where it's not wanted. And only in manual flight. And pilots are trained when they get an input into their flight controls that they did not ask for, that is not appropriate for the regime of flight, then they go through procedures. In this case, it's called runaway stabilizer trim procedure, and that is what would be done in this instance. In normal operation for the MCAS, you would never feel the input.
Did these pilots' training or procedure let them know that pulling back the yoke would not disengage this system?
I'm not quite sure what you're referring to about pulling back the yoke and stopping it, because that's not actually a
So I'm reading a quote from the New York Times on February 3rd, 2019, where the Times reported older 737s had a way of addressing certain control problems with the stabilizers. Pulling back on the yoke or control column would cut off electronic control of the stabilizers, allowing the pilots to control them manually. And that was not true with the 737 MAX. Now, is that correct factually? I'm relying on the Times reporting here.
So I don't believe that's correct. They're the same ways to deal with the MCAS inappropriate input is the same thing a pilot would do for runaway stab trim for an NG. It's the same input and the same procedure. In fact, the procedure for runaway stab trim does not change from the NG to the MAX. It presents itself the same way, and it's dealt with the same way.
Now, the MCAS system itself relied on angle of attack sensors that, as the Washington Post reported, quote, angle of attack sensors have been flagged as problems more than 50 times on U.S. commercial airplanes over the past 5 years. How did the FAA come to the conclusion that it was appropriate to certify an anti-stall software system, the MCAS, that not only drew data from a sensor that had a history of problems, but also that didn't have redundancy?
So the AOA vanes are an input to the MCAS system. The MCAS system is actually not an anti-stall system. It's not a system unto itself. It is a supplement to, as I said, the speed trim system that existed in the NG, does the same thing that this STS does in the NG. I am not aware of AOAs being a problem. 50 malfunctions of an AOA or 50 maintenance procedures to an AOA across the gamut of flight where AOA vanes and all of the flights that use AOA is not in the, you're talking about numbers of hundreds of thousands of flights.
Unless there's a system where the malfunction then causes the plane to crash, then that is a serious issue.
Well, sir, it is still yet to be determined if the malfunctioning of the AOA caused the crash. We actually don't know the cause of the crash. There's a lot more to find out through the investigation. But I am confident in, I'm confident in the AOA vanes that are produced and put on airplanes, and I'm confident in the MCAS system. Now, where we need to go is we need to get all the information, all the data from the accident to determine the interaction between all of them. And it isn't just airframe, or it isn't just the AOA, it isn't just the MCAS. There's quite a few more factors in any investigation that we have to determine. We have to gather the data. We're a data-driven organization, and we make our decisions based on the data collected, and we still have a lot of data to collect, sir.
Senator Sinema.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Mr. Elwell, but I welcome responses from any of our guests. According to media reports, the initial failure classification for the MCAS enabled its safety evaluation to be delegated to Boeing. And according to media reports, during testing, FAA did not completely and properly review technical documents provided by Boeing. So how do we ensure that FAA can take over safety evaluation if issues are discovered during the testing and evaluation phase?
Thank you for that question, Senator. What you're referring to is the Organizational Designation Authority. In the course of a certification such as an amended type cert that the 737 MAX went through, the FAA determines what aspects of the delegation or what aspects of the certification can be delegated. And usually those are normal, well-known legacy type systems. And in the case of the 737 MAX, the FAA, retained MCAS for review at the beginning of the certification process. As the process goes on, ODA is amended and is amended many times in the course of a certification as the FAA reviews and certifies the expertise of the manufacturer to take on more of the delegated authority under very strict review by the FAA. And we, at times in the course of a certification, will find areas that we want to pay more attention to, and we will retain those items. So it is a active, constantly changing dynamic in a certification, and that's what happened during the certification of the MAX.
A second question then for you, Mr. Elwell. So MCAS is new to the Boeing MAX aircraft, and I was wondering if you could talk to us about why the system was not included in pilot training materials, and who makes the determination regarding what is included in pilot training materials?
So when we're doing a new certification, whether it's an amended or a new type, there's a flight standardization board that is a group of experts and pilots and engineers whose responsibility it is to determine, and in this case, an amended type certificate, if the handling characteristics of the new aircraft require flight training, or if the differences between the new aircraft and the one that it's amending does not require flight training. What the MCAS did was correct for some very slight modifications that the MAX had. The MAX has slightly larger diameter engines with not a whole lot of extra thrust, similar thrust, but because of the width of the engines, they had to go forward on the wing. And because of the diameter of the engines, the nose wheel had to be extended 6 inches. These are not big changes as far as the FAA is concerned for an amended. But what we need to do is put pilots in simulators and fly the aircraft that's being amended and the new aircraft. And after many scenarios, flights in all regimes, sim flights in all regimes with these pilots, there was a consensus opinion from the pilots, the European, Canadian, American pilots, that there was no marked difference in the handling characteristics of these two aircraft. And that is what we need to determine what kind of flight training or not is needed. And there was, by the recommendation of the Flight Standardization Board, and understand this is a board that has been used dozens and dozens of times, and their unanimous opinion was flight training was not needed. And they didn't flight test the MCAS per se because, as I said, the MCAS is a device that is supplement to another system that is specifically designed for the yoke to feel correctly to the pilot in all regimes of flight.
My last question is for each of the witnesses, and I wonder if you have suggestions for legislative or regulatory changes that can ensure an aircraft is independently and appropriately evaluated for operational safety. Is there more we need to do?
Thank you, Senator Sinema. Yes, there may be. However, for me as Inspector General to offer suggestions today would be entirely premature. As you know, Secretary Chow, Senator Blumenthal, and other congressional requesters have asked my office to start at the very beginning, thinking of these as bookends. We want to look at the certification process. I can outline very quickly for you what that'll entail. We want to look at the key decisions made by FAA when certifying the airplane and the timeline. We want to determine when MCAS was added to the aircraft and why FAA approved it, or the extent of FAA's involvement in Boeing's decision to approve it, how FAA reached the decision that pilots did not need additional training, or that details about the new system did not need to be included in the airplane's manual. That's the first bookend. The second bookend, in my view, will be how FAA responded to the recent accidents, and that's specifically Senator Blumenthal's question. Clearly, confidence in FAA as the gold standard for aviation safety has been shaken. We can help provide information to the Secretary and to the Congress to determine how best to restore FAA to that position. The second bookend, we hope, will shed some light on the obvious question as to why FAA might have been the last. It was the last, in fact, safety regulator to decide to ground the 737 MAX. Other safety regulators around the world decided that in their role as safety regulators, they needed to drive risk to zero, and they did that by grounding the aircraft. Acting Administrator Elwell has testified that they were continuing the hunt for data in order to inform that decision. So that disparity, that apparent disparity in appreciation of the safety regulator's role should be another question I respectfully submit for the Congress and the Secretary. We hope to present information to all of you to help inform your decision-making.
Ranking Member Sinema, thank you for your question. The NTSB has looked at that issue as it relates to particular crashes. For example, coming out of the 2013 Asiana crash at San Francisco, we recommended that the FAA convene a special certification design review of how the Boeing 777 automated flight control system controls airspeed. And we wanted the FAA to look at that, and we've classified that recommendation as open, alternate, acceptable response. Coming out of the 787 battery fire event that we investigated that same year, we talked about the use of engineering designees. Since 1999, we've issued 8 recommendations to the FAA concerning the use of engineering designees. 3 are still open. The remaining 4 have been closed acceptably. We do want the FAA to provide certification engineers with written guidance, training to address opportunities to improve the certification process outcomes. And so that would be where we stand on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Elwell, you told Senator Sinema that part of certification was based on pilots flying simulators in multiple different scenarios. Did any of those scenarios include angle of attack sensors malfunctioning and reporting the wrong data to the MCAS system?
So I can get an answer for you on that, but I don't believe so. I believe that they were all in the full range of the flight envelope for flight characteristics. Again, the MCAS, the issue of an AOA vane giving the MCAS the wrong information, causing it to give nose down input to the stabilizer trim, presents as a scenario all pilots are trained on and familiar with. It's called runaway stabilizer trim, and the actions that they take to defeat it are the same as they would find in any other cause of a stab trim malfunction, which could be the motor going off when it shouldn't. So it is indistinguishable to the pilot.
Chairman Wicker.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Mr. Sumwalt, the Indonesian Civil Aviation Authority has issued a preliminary report. How long did that take after the crash of Lion Air?
The accident occurred, Senator, on October the 29th, and I believe the preliminary report was issued on November the 27th. So
Okay.
about 30 days.
Do you think we can expect a preliminary report then from Ethiopia within about a month?
I do. Our investigators are very engaged with the Ethiopian government. We're working very closely with them, providing assistance in the development of a draft report, and we do expect it in the very near future.
I assume you're getting all the cooperation you need from the Ethiopian government.
Yes, sir, we are.
From the Indonesian government.
Absolutely.
What do you know about the Lion Air crash that you don't know about Ethiopian Air at this point?
Well, I've read the Lion Air preliminary report that was issued in November. I will say a very ticklish issue is that there's a law, an actual law, 49 U.S.C. 1114, that prohibits anyone from disclosing information concerning a foreign investigation unless that information has been cleared by the host country. So I am not the one to speak about either of those two accidents.
Mr. Scovel, are you going to have a recommendation about that law? Do you have an opinion about that law? Is it a problem?
Conceivably, it might be. Certainly in the desire of the Congress and the administration to foster transparency and determine best route ahead. At this point, I certainly don't have a recommendation for you.
Okay, well, if the witnesses would get back to us on that, we'd appreciate it. You have to have some time to consider that. Now, there was a nose-down input, Mr. Sumwalt. In other words, the pilots experienced the MCAS system kicking in and pushing the nose down. I understand it was some 21 times before the plane eventually crashed. Is that your understanding, sir?
Which accident are you referring to, sir?
Lion Air.
I think that's about right, based
And
on my reading.
over what period of time would that have been?
I'm not sure, sir.
What should the pilots have done there?
Well, I flew the 737 for 10 years, and I do believe that there is a procedure, at least for the Flintstone version of the 737 I flew, a very old 737. But I do believe that the first thing you would do is oppose that motion by pulling the yoke back, and that should engage a stab brake. Now, apparently, that feature is not on the
Mr. Elwell, what should they have done? What should the pilot have done? Based on 21 times the system kicking in, pushing the nose down.
Mr. Chairman, I did not fly the 737, so I can only speak to the airplane, all the different airplanes I flew. But when you
Well,
have,
I'm actually asking about this aircraft. Do you know? If you don't know, that's fine.
I'm sorry, I'd have to get back to you on the specific. There is a non-normal checklist, an NNC on runways.
It would be helpful for us to know, based on the expertise at this table, what should have occurred in the cockpit based on that nose-down input. Mr. Elwell, then discuss, if you don't mind, the point that Mr. Scovel mentioned and that a lot of us have about the decision made by other countries initially to ground the aircraft. What data they had. Was this just an abundance of caution, or was it based on facts that these agencies had that we didn't have here in the United States? Help us understand the decision there.
Yes, sir. It's a very important question. The FAA, to make a decision to ground a fleet of aircraft, is going to do that on a data-based information that we have to warrant a grounding. I can't speak to the reasoning that the other nations took. I know that in communication with those countries, in our request, what data might they have, they did not have any data for us. In fact, there were several countries in communications with us who, after grounding the aircraft, asked us what data we had and what we might suggest for them for ungrounding when the time was right.
Was your decision based on data, or just
Our
the fact that
decision was
everybody else
based on
doing? And what was that data?
So on about Wednesday morning, mid-morning, we received data that gave us refined flight track. We had initial flight track data Monday that was unreliable, and it was actually, we were not able to interpret it and to create a flight track. That data was refined on Tuesday night into Wednesday by the company that actually produced the data or received the data through their satellite system. And with the help of the NTSB and Boeing, that data was refined to the point where we could have a flight track, a 6-minute flight track of the Ethiopian Air flight. And we found information on the ground that corroborated for us in a briefing on Wednesday morning that the flight track of Ethiopian Airlines was very similar to the flight track of Lion Air. And that data told us that there was very possibly a link between the two flights. And when you have the possibility of a link between two accidents of the same type aircraft, it's prudent to ground them until you find what that link is, mitigate that link. And the important thing to know about using data, we may have been, I think someone said, the last country to ground the aircraft, but the United States and Canada were the first countries to ground the aircraft with data for cause and purpose. And that's important because when you ground a fleet of aircraft for a reason, a definable reason, then you have something by which to unground them when you've mitigated that or you've solved it or you've found that link.
Mr. Chairman, I know we're over, but Mr. Sumwalt seems to be nodding his head. Are you are you in agreement with the approach that Mr. Elwell has outlined as having been taken by the FAA?
Well, the NTSB was not involved in the grounding decision.
All right.
We supplied data that they could use to make that decision.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Canwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Elwell, did you say in or answering an earlier question to Senator Sinema that the FAA retained the authority over the MCAS system, that it wasn't delegated?
I said that it originally, we retained it as a new system and then released it to the ODA, to the delegation, designation.
So if someone is characterizing it as delegated, then it was delegated.
Right. So initially, as a new system or a new device on the amended type certificate, we retained the oversight of that, and then over time released that to the ODA when we had the comfort level and the oversight, and we've examined it thoroughly, and we were able to assure that the ODA members of Boeing had the expertise and the knowledge of the system to continue going forward.
And so that kind of information is something you can make available to members now, or is that something that will be part of the investigation?
I'm sure, Senator, that we could get that information to you on exactly the timing and how that went. And of course, in the investigations and the audits that are ongoing about the certification process here, this will all be very transparent and clear.
Well, I do think transparency is important.
Absolutely.
And so I read statements where you're saying it wasn't delegated, or I hear your answer here, and then I read things in the press that say it was delegated, and I think the public wants to understand this whole system, and obviously Mr. Scovel and various IG reports is reviewing that, and I appreciate those reports and that review. And I, as I mentioned in my opening statement, appreciate Secretary Chow convening some experts of aviation analysis to also look at that system and review. So anyway, we'll look forward to getting that information from you on what that looked like as the FAA retained that oversight, and then once they were certain, then delegated. I'm not sure what they delegated, but you will get that to us. This larger question in my mind is, Mr. Scovel also mentioned that it is so that pilots rely on automated flight systems, that the FAA ensure that carriers meet its requirements to train pilots on how to respond to abnormal flight conditions. Mm-hmm. And I think you also, Mr. Scovel, mentioned stall situations. So how is the FAA making sure that that is achieved, in particularly this area of human and machine interface? I think that the public wants to understand, and I think it's probably across a lot of transportation sectors, want to understand what we're doing on testing to make sure that these safety factors of functionality are there, particularly when the functionality is between a machine and a machine and a human interface. How are we testing for that? And in this case, how are we testing?
Yes, Senator. The FAA is intensely interested in the interface between the pilot and the machine. And over time, that relationship has changed. And as aircraft become more automated, we have this, clearly automation is one of the most important aspects for the amazing increase and improvement in safety we've seen over decades. But automation brings with it certain challenges. And as the IG has pointed out, if most of the time automation is on in an aircraft, there's always been this concern that, well, then pilot skills degrade. So when I was flying in the airlines, we had, within the airline itself, we had some rules about making sure that you hand flew frequently enough to keep that sharpness. But certainly, we look very, very closely at the training requirements and the human interface and what automation does, the safety benefits, and what the challenges are with it. So we watch that very closely.
And so you think there was enough of that training involved here?
Oh, Senator, I do. Because the MCAS, remember, the MCAS operates in manual mode. It's not an automated, it's not with autopilot on. It actually, as I said earlier, it makes its whole purpose is to give the pilot the proper feel with a fly-by-wire yoke while he or she is flying. So it interjects in manual mode. It does not interject in automatic mode. And as I said, when that MCAS is doing things that it's not supposed to do, pilots feel it. It presents itself as uncommanded pitch trim, and pilots of large aircraft are trained from the beginning of their careers how to handle that.
Well, I mentioned this, and I mentioned the Colgan families who were here, because I think that's been their main mantra, that there wasn't enough training on that particular system, or at least from a co-pilot perspective. And I think I saw that Captain Sully had also made similar comments recently. We've had a lot of debate here about this as it relates to making sure that two pilots are. But I really do want to understand the FAA's role, and certainly Mr. Scovel's review of that human-machine interface, because my guess is we're going to continue to move forward, but we have to get this right. We have to get this right. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired.
Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elwell, as you know, the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018 contained several bipartisan provisions aimed at improving and modernizing FAA's aircraft certification process, to include the establishment of an Organization Designation Authorization Office within FAA's Office of Aviation Safety, designed to improve operational safety by strengthening oversight of ODA holders delegated to perform certain functions on behalf of FAA. Could you provide a timeline on when you expect this office to be fully established?
Thanks for that question, Senator Thune. Absolutely. In fact, we already established the new ODA office, as you mentioned, prescribed in last year's FAA bill. On March 5th, we created and stood up the office.
And as a follow-up, the FAA bill also established an expert review panel to survey ODA holders and evaluate the effectiveness of the ODA process. Do you have an update on when you expect this review panel to be established?
I don't have it off the top of my head, Senator, but I will certainly get that information to you. It may already be in place, but I don't have that in my notes.
Thank you. That would be great if you could get us that information. Boeing recently, and I would direct this to you, Mr. Elwell, too. Boeing recently stated that the 737 MAX series aircraft was certified, and I quote, certified in accordance with the identical FAA requirements and processes that have governed certification of all previous new airplanes and derivatives, end quote. Could you provide some examples of other aircraft models where the FAA has certified a variant aircraft in a manner similar to the process that was used for the 737 MAX?
Well, Senator, the process to determine whether it is an amended type certificate or a new type is the same, regardless of the manufacturer, the type to which you're amending or making that determination. And it goes to the points I made earlier about flyability. So first and foremost, that the criteria is examined as to whether there's a fundamental difference in the thrust, weight, flight characteristics of the applicant for an amended type. Those, as I said, are tried and true methods that we've used for decades on amended certificates. I know sometimes, in my case, when I flew the Super 80, we added to our fleet type the Super 80s from another airline in a merger. They had a different cockpit layout, but the plane was fundamentally the same. There was a couple of different options, but it handled the same. So it was an amended type, and we went through differences training because the flight deck had some different things in it that we needed to get used to. But that's the fundamental things that the fundamental things that we look at.
That you look at. So, as a follow-up, was there anything specific about the design of the 737 MAX that differentiates the model certification process from some of those examples that you just mentioned?
Well, sir, the 737 MAX, it is and required certainly an amended type certificate. And again, primarily because of the new modern complexities that it brought to the table. It did bring the MCAS into the equation, but the MCAS was a supplement or an addition to a system that already existed in the NG. The engine position on the wing was different, and it's what required, actually. It's what necessitated the addition of MCAS. And there were some differences in the screens, what was on the screens, but fundamentally, the aircraft layout, the handling, and the performance of the aircraft was the same, and thus the decision to make it an amended type certificate.
Okay. Mr. Sumwalt, you mentioned in your testimony both the benefits and safety concerns related to the integration of UAS into the nation's airspace. As you know, the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018 included numerous provisions related to the safe operation of this emerging technology. Are there any pending regulatory actions at the FAA in particular that you see as most important to ensuring the safe integration of drones into our airspace?
Thank you for that question, Senator Thune. As you're aware, the FAA recently enacted Part 107 to the Federal Aviation Regulations, which imposes more regulatory requirements for drone operators, and we see that as a positive.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I see my time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your willingness to be here today. Take questions.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you. The two tragic airplane crashes included, by the way, those dead was a beloved community member from St. Cloud, Minnesota, Muhammad Hussein, and I know his family is grief-stricken. And following these crashes, as many of my colleagues has talked about, it is very important that we figure out our certification process and get it right so we can prevent similar tragedies in the future. Mr. Elwell, I know you've been asked about this, but let me try it a different way. Are there any safety measures the FAA may have miscalculated when evaluating the safety features of the Boeing 737 MAX?
Senator Klobuchar, thank you for that question. We certify aircraft in a way that we have refined, as I said, for large aircraft, large commercial aircraft. It's been refined 130 times, over 130 times since we started doing these. In every certification, we learn something new. From every IG audit, from every,
Was this consistent with how you've done other certifications in other situations, the Boeing situation?
Yes, ma'am. This was an amended type certification that followed the procedures we used to determine and then to execute amended type certificates. But
if you learn something else after this investigation or other things come out, you may change that process.
Absolutely. That's how we get better.
And Mr. Scovel, what is your office's timeline for this audit?
Thanks, Senator. We always shoot for 10 months. This is a very tall order for us, as I'm sure you can appreciate. We have a highly skilled team of aviation safety auditors who will all turn to. If we can meet 10 months, I'd optimistically say great. It may well be some months after that. We will get to it as soon as we possibly can because we truly appreciate your interest on all these matters.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Elwell, back to you. According to a recent New York Times article, Boeing charged airlines extra for critical safety features. These were optional add-ons. Following the crashes, does the FAA plan to update the requirements for aircraft safety features or take other action to mandate that these features are not optional?
Mm-hmm. Well, Senator Klobuchar, when we certify an aircraft, whether it's amended or a new type, critical safety features, that's an important term. If something is a critical safety feature on an aircraft, a passenger aircraft that we certify, it's not optional. So critical safety features are part of the certification package. And I think what you're referring to is AOA displays on the CRTs in the cockpit. And I can tell you, as a pilot who's flown aircraft, several aircraft in the military and the civilian world. I had aircraft that had AOA displays in the cockpit, and I had aircraft that didn't. And it all depends on what the rest of the